I have known Salty for a long time, but I've not really known him for a long time. And the reason I say that is because I actually first met Salty back in probably 1987.
Why do we got to bring up years?
When I was teaching ROTC at MIT and my wife was teaching ROTC at Boston University, and Salty was one of the students there, and there are several BU alum in the audience here today, at least one I can see, from that ROTC detachment. So I've known of Salty all his career, but I was not his instructor. That was my wife had that great pleasure to do that. But I've heard of Salty a lot because she would always come home and say things about this cadet, and I won't tell you what she said. But during his career, folks like Salty and Bill LaQuarrie and Chuck Cinnamon and Arnie Stralin and all these folks who, quite frankly, are pretty much legends in the space business, all came out of the Boston University detachment, and Salty is the one who now sits in front of us today. That just brings that heritage back around. And I have gotten now to work with Salty, not that much, but a lot of deep, insightful thoughts over the last couple of years, especially as we talk about space organization. And Salty is one of the best minds I've found in the uniform right now to think about that topic. He is right now has taken on a new role in the Air Force as the head of current ops on the air operations staff. So when Marty was there, Marty took over the future ops jobs. Salty started in future ops, but I think the future has now become the current, so now he's just the current ops guy. So with that introduction, let me turn the mic over to Brigadier General Salty Saltzman.
Well, what are you supposed to say to that? I did learn a lot from Major Lavero, 1987 Major Lavero, and she was great. Stephanie was terrific. I don't know much about across the river at that other school. This is pretty humbling. Can everybody hear me okay? We're good? All right. This is pretty humbling. Old mentors, people whose jobs I stole, Marty Whalen, for example, and like Doug said, future ops became current ops. Really, in the Pentagon, current ops is what happened yesterday. Future ops is what's happening today, and then everything else is the 5 to do. But there's a lot of challenges, and space is right up there amongst them. Let me just say I'm a little nervous to address this crowd. Like I said, old mentors. General Basler gave me a lot of good pointers as a young 06. I watched General Heffelbauer train JFACs out in Korea several times, and so this is a daunting crowd. I told my wife, I don't know what exactly I'm going to say. This is such a august group of space professionals, and she said, well, I don't know what you're going to say either, but don't try to be too charming, too witty, or too intellectual. Just be yourself. The people that are laughing hardest know her, and that she was sincere about that. Back in September, General Goldfein asked me to take on leadership of what he called his Big Rock number 3, enhancing multi-domain command and control. You're flattered anytime the chief asks you to do something like this, and I said, sir, I only have 2 questions. What's multi-domain and what's command and control? And he spent about a half hour with me, which is a lot of time with this chief, walking through his vision of what multi-domain operations is and what command and control of those operations should look like. And so what I hope to do is give you a little insight into that vision, some of the challenges we've uncovered as we progress down that path, and some of the things we're thinking about doing. For this audience, I'm going to try to show you where space connects to it, but one of the things you'll learn right out of the gate is we're trying not to talk about space operations anymore, or air operations, or cyber operations. The Air Force has to understand how these things integrate together in offense and defense simultaneously, synergistically, and we call that multi-domain operations. So I hope to give you a little bit of insight into that. In fact, the challenge that the chief kind of said is in front of us is that we've done so well with our air capabilities, with integrating space, with leveraging our cyber capabilities, that our adversaries have taken notice. And I'm probably not the first to tell this group that the investments that our adversaries have made are targeted very specifically on denying us those strategic advantages that we've come to enjoy, not the least of which is the advantages we enjoy in space. And so they've invested heavily. It's no surprise that anti-satellite weaponry is coming into the forefront. If they can deny us those capabilities, they know it will complicate almost every operation that we try to engage in across the globe. I was going to say good fortune, I had the opportunity to be in a unique place on January 11th, 2007. And if you know that date, that's the date the Chinese destroyed their own Fangyang 1 Charlie weather satellite. I was a relatively new lieutenant colonel, and I was the chief of combat ops on the JSPOC floor. The Joint Space Operations Center was a little less than a year old at the time. There had been a tradition of the 614th AOC, but as a joint command and control center for the newly established Joint Functional Component Command space at the time, it was Lieutenant General Shelton. We were still learning our ways. In fact, we had a space tasking order to the AOCers in the crowd. We had a space tasking order, but no real equivalent to the Master Air Attack Plan. And there was no real equivalent to the Air Ops Directive. These are the strategy and planning documents that usually precede that tasking order that makes sense of it. We started right with tasking. We know what to tell people to do. We just don't know why to tell them to do it. So at the time, we were working backwards into maturing these AOC processes. What does a strategy directive look like from a space standpoint? And what does a master space plan tell the planners so that they can build the right kind of tasking orders? And we were maturing all that. And so one of the lessons that I'd like to impart to you that we've learned through this ECCT effort is we have to continue to mature the domain capabilities in space and cyber, because describing space in particular as a joint warfighting domain is relatively new. And the 70+ years of lessons that we've learned contesting the air, many of those are almost directly applicable to how we should organize, train, equip, operate in space as a joint warfighting domain as well. So I say the JSPOC experience because those are some great first steps to take what we do in the air and try to bring them up so that we can start to integrate. And I hope that this multi-domain C2 effort continues that maturation to some degree. Back to January 11th, 2007. I'm standing on the JSPOC ops floor. I'm not kidding you. It's less than 25% the size of this room. It's not, if you've been there recently, it's not the big hangar facility that we built later. It was the 3rd floor of the headquarters building, and it was just the small skiff room up there on the 3rd floor. And that was where we did operations. And I literally stood behind the desk, and I was on the phone with the sensors that we knew would be the first to see this event when it unfolded. And if I looked to my left, there was a plate glass window, which was the commander's conference room, and General Shelton was just sitting in the conference room staring at me. So I'm on the phone. They report multiple head count. That's space code for one object has become more than one object, which is bad in space. And so I turned to General Shelton, and I realized that I couldn't just yell at him because he's behind glass. I didn't know what to do, so I gave kind of a thumbs up, and then that sounded like we're good and not them. So then I kind of did this at the same time. This is the worst hand signals for such a monumental space event. But that's what I did, and I thought, well, that wasn't useful intelligence. But it did make the 3-star laugh at a pretty tense moment. But let's talk about that. First, I was on the phone. I was on a telephone. That's how I was getting situational awareness. Let that sink in. I had to give hand signals to the 3-star. They were bad ones, but I had to give hand signals to the 3-star to relay what little situational awareness I had to the operational decision maker. And he was on speakerphone because he's a 3-star, right? So he had a speakerphone with the combatant commander in Omaha at US Stratcom, and he simply said, it looks like they were successful. That was what he relayed. The third part of this that's most interesting to me is with the magnitude of the event that has just occurred, what we were doing on the combat ops floor of the Joint Space Ops Center is trying to figure out how we're going to rapidly catalog all these new pieces of debris. And that was it. That was what we were focused on. And the idea of hundreds of pieces of debris was problematic for us. And we were clearly staring at millions of pieces of debris and had no idea how we could possibly pull that off. And so we've come a long way since then, I can promise you. That was 10 years ago. But there are still those same kinds of challenges that we face on the space side as we continue to try to mature our capabilities. So the threat to deny us space advantages, cyber advantages have definitely increased. If you heard General Goldfein describe the fullness of future war, he uses 5 kind of tenets of future war. He says all future war is definitely going to be multi-domain. And when he says multi-domain, he means from subsurface to the surface where the land and maritime forces operate, to air, to space, and virtually as cyber. That's his multi-domain world as he describes it. Probably more pertinent right now is that it's going to be multi-regional. We're still going to have to create effects where people live, operate, and have political power, because that's where wars occur. They are human endeavors. And we have to be able to manage regional conflict that extends beyond the regions. And so, again, if you've heard him talk about this, he says Russia is not a Yukon problem. For example, it's a global problem. And we're going to have to use all of our regional combatant commanders. We're going to have to use all the functional combatant commanders. And we're going to have to use them in real time, simultaneously, in very exquisite support and supporting relationships. And this can become a complicated command and control structure. The third one is, of course, and this is obvious, it's joint. It's multi-service. There's nothing that we can do without being in a joint fight. That's the way we're designed. That's the way we build our systems. We're inherently joint from birth, but that still creates complications. You have to pull in that much more data. You have to work with that many more component commanders. You have to build that much more situational awareness to be effective in providing support or for receiving support from those various components. And fourth, and I think this is a big one, we're going to be multinational. We are going to fight as a coalition. And I like the way the chief says this. He says it's one of our asymmetric advantages as a nation. One of the things that we bring to any conflict is the fact that we do it as a global force. We do it as multi-nation, and there's not a lot of our adversaries that can pull that off. And that coalition itself is a tremendous asymmetric advantage. From my vantage point, though, it's a tremendous command and control challenge. To integrate foreign capabilities, to share information across the coalition, these are all challenges that we're going to have to address. And we clearly see those things in the space community as well. And lastly, and what is a thread that will run through all of these multi-challenges, is the speed with which future war will occur. Information technology, the ubiquitous of sensors, the speed that data can move around, social networking, the omnipresence of the media, all of these things accelerate the ops tempo for senior decision makers all the way down to the tactical level. And if we don't have a command and control system that can operate at those speeds, we're going to be inevitably behind the power curve and not as effective in generating effects. Multi-domain, multi-regional, multinational, multi-service, and fast. All of those are kind of my collective challenge to sort out as we start to build command and control that makes the seams that inevitably have to be there because of those truths, make those seams operationally irrelevant. It just won't matter that there's seams because the C2 structure will be able to navigate and manage them more effectively. That's kind of the rose that was pinned on me. It sounded pretty simple when I walked out of his office, I started talking to a bunch of SMEs, and it got really complicated really fast. Probably some of you added to my headaches in that regard. So the other thing I want to talk about is what does the chief mean when he says multi-domain operations? And this is important because there's a vast number of us who have been in operations that we say, well, we kind of already do multi-domain operations. And what became clear to me as I kind of investigated all this is we operate in multiple domains, certainly, but truly integrating those domains so that one domain, if you're denied by an adversary, can be replaced by operations and effects generated from another domain. We're not quite there. We have good examples where it's true, but it's not a part of our routine business. And so when you think about multi-domain operations of the future, don't think about operations in space and cyber supporting an air campaign, or Air Forces from the Air Force supporting a maritime campaign. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the adversary has to plan to cover and protect across the entire landscape of all domains simultaneously, because we can generate offensive and defensive effects from multiple attack vectors simultaneously at a tempo he can't respond to. That's multi-domain operations, the way it's envisioned. And then lastly is, I asked him, all right, what's this command and control? I'm a satellite operator. Command and control is sending up maneuver commands or pulling down telemetry, and that's clearly not what he had in mind. You can talk to different services, you can talk to different disciplines inside our own service, and they'll kind of give you different pictures of what command and control is. And he gave me his vision, and I'll be honest with you, this is just between us, right? We talked through what he meant by what he said, and we got to common ground on what operational command and control meant. And it's not quite nuclear C3. That's not what he's talking about, although we have to take care of that. And we're also not talking about the tactical command and control down at battalion and squadron level where you're doing the nuts and bolts and weapons loading and those sort of things. Those are all a part of command and control. The JTACs on the ground doing close air support, that close coordination, all a part of command and control. My challenge is kind of in that operational level middle, which naturally makes airmen think about the AOC, which is kind of a battle. I'm not exactly talking about an AOC. I'm trying to keep it not brick and mortar specific, but a little broader in terms of concepts. And so what I did is, after kind of scouring the doctrine, I came up with 3 primary critical functions that I called operational command and control. They won't surprise anybody. I'm not that smart. It's situational awareness, operational decision-making, and force direction. After talking to some experts, we added a 4th function that we called battle management, because we thought it was critical that once you were engaged with an adversary, you had to think differently about command and control. And so what battle management is just a subset of situational awareness, operational decision-making, and force direction, but it's while you're in the presence and interaction with an adversary. And so those become kind of the 4 key functions that we're trying to address to meet those tenets of future war and make those seams operationally manageable. All right, so far so good? It's good. It gets complicated. I get lost all the time in this, but okay. We have 57 stakeholder organizations helping us. We have representatives of all the services. We have representatives on the Joint and OSD staff. I've talked to all the think tanks that I can reach out to in this area. We've talked to academia. We've talked to commercial industry, obviously. I cast the net as wide as I possibly could with the time allotted in the day. And what we found out is this is hard stuff. There's a lot going on. And so to some degree, just organizing the effort and kind of aligning us all in the same direction became one of the most primary considerations. And after all of that investigation, I kept looking for how do I write the ConOps that gets at multi-domain command and control? Or what are the key technologies that if we buy, we will be able to facilitate multi-domain command and control? And it turned out that's a fool's errand. What I learned was there is no ConOps that gets after this. There is no key technology that solves all of our multi-domain. There's not even a family of key technologies that solves this. The 2 kind of central findings that we've come to realize is that, first and foremost, multi-domain command and control is about decision superiority. It's about the ability to gain an advantage over the adversary in the information space, first and foremost. Now, you got to be able to do something with that, but first and foremost, it's about gaining and maintaining decision superiority, that information advantage. And then secondly, it's not about the product, it's about the process. And I'll give you an example for those that are indoctrinated like me in Air Force terms. It's probably not a surprise that when we think about the tactics that our Air Forces use, if you don't continue to innovate those tactics, they get stale and adversaries find ways to counter them and your tactics don't work anymore. So we have this process called weapons and tactics, where we have realistic training review boards that watch training and they address with the MAGCOM staffs on what the shortfalls are. The combatant commanders give us threat assessments and mission requirements, and we say, are we training our crews to be able to perform to those threats and standards that the combatant commanders are giving us? And anywhere the answer is no, we say, well, then what do we need to change? And we provide those to our tactics community, and they start to explore different ways to defeat threats. A lot of times those tactics that they come up with need to be tested, and we have a test community that validates those tests against simulations and against uprange threats. We use ranges, we use aggressors, we use red flags. All of that is to make sure that our tactics are leading edge tactics. So the question is, if you raise that up a level to operational C2 and you say we have to perpetually and continually make our command and control leading edge, how do we do it? What's the WEPTAC model that we can apply to command and control? And that's what I think we're trying to build, is the process to perpetually and continually do two important things. Revise our operational concepts. How do we manage support and supporting relationships? What are the processes in the operations centers that need to be adjusted? How does the combat ops floor at the JSPOC synchronize with the combat ops floor at Al-Udeid so that multi-domain operations is synced in time and space? What are the procedures you use? Secondly, what's the technology? What's the next best technology that we need to employ to do this kind of multi-domain command and control? How do we leverage big data analytics, automation, artificial intelligence? And how do we bring those technologies to bear inside the tech cycle? If it takes us 3 years to come up with an idea and field it, that's not going to be useful to the operators. The tech cycles have moved too fast. So how do we have a process that rapidly evaluates new technology and gets it in the hands of our C2 pros? And then how do we evaluate our operational processes to make sure that our C2 processes are at the leading edge? That's what we're trying to tackle with multi-domain C2. This is not an uncomplicated problem. It's a big cultural shift. The way General Goldfein has kind of described it to me is this is what's necessary to move from kind of an industrial age thought about the war or war planning and war execution. There's a serial process that we kind of got comfortable with, to more of an information age. It's rapid change. It's high velocity operations. It's about information as much as it is about effects. In fact, we think if you have enough information, you might be able to maneuver where you don't have to create kinetic effects. And that's pretty easy to visualize in a space domain. You know, if you start talking about two objects moving at each other at pretty quick closure rates, the ability to see it, recognize it, assess it, and maneuver so that it's not a problem is preeminent. Dealing with debris is a far bigger problem. So how do we have the exquisite indications and warnings that will allow us to do that? That's where multi-domain command and control is headed. And I'm on a roll. I love this stuff. But I do want to save some time for questions. So let me kind of wrap up by saying, hey, that's great, Salty. Those are great ideas. Let's put that in a glossy pamphlet and we'll pass that around and everybody will be happy. I'm not satisfied with that. I like something tangible. And so for the operational concepts, I'm also recognizing that we are capacity limited. We're short in terms of airmen, and I mean that across all of the career fields. The Air Force is small for what it's being asked to do. And so the idea of just saying, well, let's build another war game, let's build another set of experiments and exercises, that will deflate our troops. They are busy. And so just adding more of those to them is probably not going to work. But I think we need to do it. And so what we need to do is say, well, are there existing exercises that can be kind of morphed to address some of these specific multi-domain learning objectives that are so critical to moving forward? And we think the answer is yes. And so we're going to look at the blue flags and the red flags and the space flags, and we're going to see how do we put all this together so that we have kind of a coherent picture of how to do multi-domain operations. Currently, we have exercises and war games that kind of span from the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level. We have exercise Plan Blue, some of you might have heard about, where Air Force general officers get together at the strategic level and think about the war of the future. We clearly have blue flags that kind of deal at the operational level and red flags at the tactical level. How do we stitch all those together? You know, where there's common threads, we can learn common lessons as things transition between those levels of war and get after these specific things that we have to address with multi-domain operations. So we are going to do that, I think. I think we're on a path to do that. We're still in exploration mode. I should be clear. The results of this ECCT that I'm leading for multi-domain command and control is really about organizing the thoughts of the senior leaders. If they like what I'm pitching, they'll say yes, yes, no, no, no. And then we'll take that menu of options and we'll start to figure out how to program for it and how to put it into being. We think there's a lot of non-material solutions. On the technology side, we're going to try to leverage commercial best practices to the max extent we can. That's at the heart of this. Now, there's some changes that have to be put in place for that to be true. But we've got some good ideas, I think, to start to marry together acquirers and industry and operators in one common location so you can have a rapid feedback loop. We're going to have to figure out how to do testing so that a new application is safe, it's secure for the environment, but it goes rapidly to operations. But those are the kinds of initiatives that we're tackling pretty aggressively. And then the last piece that I'll mention before I open up to questions, and I think it really is central to a lot of this, is a cultural aspect. Again, this is not really how we've thought about using multi-domain operations currently or in the past, certainly. And C2 is really the only core mission that the Air Force has where you can't point to a couple of career fields and say, this is your job to do. You know, we have air superiority, we have space superiority. We know who to look to say, you're the experts to handle that. When it comes to operational level C2 and multi-domain command and control, what we really do is take smart people from all of the career fields, bundle them together, send them to an AOC or to the JSPOC and say, okay, you're the operational C2 team, support the JFAC, we're going to give you some training, you're going to be great at it. And you know what? They are great at it. But I think as the complexities grow, it's going to require more of a professional force. And so one of the initiatives that we're looking at, this is all still, again, exploration, but how do we train, select, identify, train, force develop a cadre of operational C2 professionals so that the blue flags are continual. It's the same people going back. You don't just drop into an AOC, do a 3-year assignment, never to return to operational C2. You may go to several AOCs in the last 8 to 10 years of your career and will gain by all that experience. What we don't want is somebody showing up to an Air Ops Center and it's the first time they've ever seen it, and it may be the last time they see it when they PCS to their next assignment. I think command and control is just going to be too complex for that to really still be a viable way for the Air Force to man those critical nodes. So that's a lot. I hope it baffles you to the point where you don't have questions, but in the off chance that it didn't, I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you.
Okay, there was quite a bit. I see already one question in the back here.
Hey, General Sam Fletcher with Congressman Lamborn. I know you weren't here earlier this morning, but my boss and Congressman Bridenstine both incidentally highlighted BMC2 being one of the main things they noticed on the Air Force's unfunded priorities list, and I don't know the extent to which you can address the budget, but anything you can share on just the mismatch between all the senior leaders talking about this, you talking about this, getting direction directly from the Chief of Staff, and yet, there's 140 million on the unfunded list for BMC2 and 100 million for SSA.
Yeah, good question. I'm sorry, I don't really have all the details on the budget and certainly what the acquisition priorities are. What I will say is that command and control is important across the board. And so the funding that's going to be available for multi-domain command and control has to account for space and cyber command and control as well. And so I really can't speak from firsthand knowledge about why it's below the line, whether it's an unfunded or needs to be funded. But I've heard from General Raymond, certainly. I've heard from General Hyten before that firsthand. And I've heard the chief talk that when we talk multi-domain command and control and the resources that we're going to put against that, it has to account for space command and control, cyber command and control, and air command and control, because collectively that's what the Air Force brings to the joint fight. And so they do see that as nested, but I'm sorry, I can't talk to the specifics on the unfundeds.
Other questions?
When you mentioned you had reached out to industry to sort of help out, I'm assuming that was your aerospace defense industry. Have you looked at other industries? Ones that come to mind are companies like Google and Amazon. When you look at how incredibly complex those companies are and what they do, like Jeff Bezos owns a rocket company and has logistics that can get you stuff delivered anywhere in the country in a few hours. And you talk about big data and things like that. It seems like those industries have actually learned a lot of very complicated lessons and somehow pull it together.
Great question. I should have said that, because I think we all generally kind of think about the same list of suspects, the usual suspects when it comes to reaching out to industry. We toured the Amazon factory out in Washington. We saw drones. We saw command and control at the warehouse level, and we asked questions like, "Hey, where do you manage all this?" And they're like, "What are you talking about? We don't centrally manage it." You know, so Amazon was one of the places that we definitely looked at. We've got good connections to the DIUX efforts in both Boston and out in Silicon Valley, and they have sent information out about what we're doing. They're on the team, and they've sent information out. So we're trying to find small groups of programmers and software designers, particularly for those parts of C2 which are very intensive in terms of software applications and big data analytics. There's a group down working through SoftWorks in SOCOM that's connected to industry doing big data analytics, and we've pulled them into our effort. So not nearly as much as we'd like to. Again, small team, we're just trying to reach out as best we can, but we're not limiting ourselves to the traditionals to the degree that we can and reach out. Thanks.
We had another question somewhere over here, right there.
Hi, sir. Philip Swartz with Space News. Following up on your comments about culture, we've had several speakers today mention a mindset that some people have that space is sort of separate from the other domains. I'm curious if you could elaborate on what efforts you're making to ensure that space is accepted as one of those integrated domains.
Yeah, great question. One of the things I struggle with in the building is every time, because I'm thinking multi-domain now, every time I hear adjectives, or use airspace and cyber as adjectives, I question about whether I could substitute any of the others and still make the statement true. Just today I heard, is space leadership going to address, and fill in the blank. And I thought, space leadership? This is an Air Force problem. This is just Air Force leadership. Why the need for a modifier? So we've tried to emphasize that every time we carve out and say this is a separate group doing separate activities, then after the fact we try to figure out how to integrate it into our operations. And we just think that's a fatal flaw to this, because then you spend so much time and energy redoing things to make it integratable. If you'd have just started from the outset and thought, how is this multi-domain from start to finish, your integration costs get a lot smaller, a lot faster. And so that's my personal technique, is just every time I hear space, I go, could I put air there? Does it still work? Can I put cyber there? Does it still work? And that seems to help get people past that cultural mindset where there's really tribes that bring capability to the joint force, and we'll let the joint force integrate it. And it's been helpful so far.
Thank you.
In the back.
Another AOC great veteran back there.
General, are there any specific, you mentioned AI, are there any specific ways we're looking to automate command and control or aspects of it, or use AI, not only in the cockpits or at strategic level, but at the AOCs?
Yes, sir. I mean, depends on what your definition of specific is, certainly. But I'll tell you that the way we framed the question is around those critical functions. So how can artificial intelligence help situational awareness? You know, how does an analyst have to look at every piece of data to turn it into intelligence, or are there ways for machines to help us turn data into intelligence? That's certainly an area that we're looking at. The other one is in operational decision making. The speed with which decisions are going to have to be made is accelerating tremendously, to the point where you can either keep passing it up the chain and hope that the 3-star is brilliant and knows exactly what calls to make, or you can have decision support software that automatically factors ROE considerations, loiter time on station considerations, weapons engagement, employment considerations, and it's all queued up for them, and you get red lights and green lights that say, sir, here's your options, and here's the clock until this decision is no longer valid. You have 7 seconds to decide. You know, those are the kinds of things that computers have to do for us, and technology is going to have to help us with. So primarily I see some of those efforts in decision support and in situational awareness initially.
Okay, other questions? Sir, Mike.
Thanks for the great work that you've done in response to the Chief's great vision and foresight. My question is about where do we go from here? How do we continue the effort, codify it, operationalize it? You know, I think back at the core function lead integrator and where that's located, and as you suggested, this is across Air Force at the operational level. So do we have thoughts on where we go from here to make it standard ops for the rest of the Air Force?
That's the thing that keeps me up at night, sir, to be honest, because as long as the chief can point to me and say multi-domain C2, it gives everybody else a pass. I don't know, this usually happens when I'm not the first speaker, but somebody has probably said, Salty will figure that out. I don't know if that happened today, but usually that's the case. Hey, we got tough issues, but don't worry, he's going to figure this all out. Well, that's a problem, right? Because at some point I'm not going to be relevant to this broader discussion. And we do have to institutionalize it. And I'm just going to go back to my previous comments. Process, not product. That's going to be the key. It's not what I deliver short of the mechanics and the processes that I think will be enduring and allow us to continually evaluate, perpetually evaluate. And then what I'm hoping that our recommendations do is remove some of those barriers so that things rapidly go from S&T through R&D to operations, acquisition, procurement, operations, as fast as possible. And I'm convinced that if you put the technologies that we're talking about, the capabilities that we're talking about in the hands of our great captains and staff sergeants, then innovation is going to explode. And then can we take advantage of it by wrapping it back through that feedback loop? And so the short answer is I'm trying to in place a process, remove the barriers, so that our junior people can really get a hold of this and tell us how to fix it. I don't have the answers, but I know they're out there. I just got to remove some of those barriers.
Other questions over here, Jim?
Hi, sir. Jim Cook with AGI. Thanks for being here and for your remarks today.
Sure.
So a quick question on the international engagement piece of this, since you said this is going to be multinational. Interoperability, data ingestion, and processing, probably automated when you talk about the types of and amounts of data that you're talking about. Have you started that outreach yet with the international countries? Is the idea to kind of allow them to come in on the sausage making, so to speak? Or is it to kind of get the Air Force act together and have a position and then approach them and kind of put that out in front of them? And that gets to be maybe a little late and a little difficult when you start going down the interoperability path.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jim. I'll tell you, my experience with the latter of those is that once the Air Force has a position, then we're in just defend mode, trying to advocate and explain why we're right. So as a result, I brought them in right at the beginning. I have an interoperability working group. It's led by a British 06 group captain that's helping me lead that effort. And quite frankly, as we go around the country, the experience of dragging a British officer with you exposes as many security issues as you ever need to collect. I was told he couldn't come into a room because the room was no foreign. I go, I'm not familiar with rooms being designated no foreign. Is there something going on in this room that we should? No, but we think there's a SIPRNet connection in there. I go, all right, guys, there's no such thing. We're not going to do this. And you get it to the right people, and of course those problems go away, and it happens. But you start stacking all those little problems together, and it's death by 1,000 cuts. And the right people aren't in the right room to collaborate at the right time. That's what we're trying to get after. There's two pieces. There's technology. When data is truly classified, how do we get it to the right people at the right time without compromising it and letting people have access that we don't want to have access to? I think that's a technology issue. I think there's ways to do that from a technology standpoint. There's also a cultural policy issue. We've been in many discussions at Schriever War Game, for example, where we keep admiring this problem. Need to know access is contrary to collaboration. As simple as that. So how do we get to more of a need to share? How do we think about risk to mission differently? Not sharing creates just as much risk to the mission as potentially sharing that information that we formerly thought should be tightly held. It's just a different way of looking at those risk models. And so we've been factoring that from day one, and I have a work group that's focused on that particular problem.
We got time for about one more question. Over here.
Hi, General Mark Sellinger, Defense Daily. Multi-domain topic may have gone over my head, but when Secretary Wilson was here this morning, she announced the creation of a Deputy Chief of Staff for Space Operations. Doesn't that go against this whole push toward multi-domain, or am I missing something? Which is quite possible.
It's a good point. If you don't really know kind of the inner workings of the Air Force, that could be confusing. I'll tell you, I'm in my third tour at the Pentagon, and operations doesn't really happen in the Pentagon, quite frankly. It happens out in the field. And as long as we're integrated in the field, I don't have concern. And I see that every day at the operational level. On the staffs, sometimes when you're moving paper around the staff and you have to advocate for a position, it's just easier to have mass centered around a particular functional type of expertise. And so I think it's a staff nuance that I don't see as a showstopper for integration of operations in the field.
Hey, Doug, can we get one more question?
Sure. All right. Just only because you paid for lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
just to tie this together, Salty, and I know this was your third tour of the Pentagon, and after 2 long tours, I feel sorry for you, my friend. But you are in a very good position to explain to us what you're talking about. A lot of speed and agility of information. Today, we heard that we have a programmatic process that is slow and oftentimes encumbered by a divided Congress. Mm-hmm. We have an acquisition process, though fair, it's incredibly archaic and slow, and we saw a chart from Christina that highlighted the results of that. I think there were 8 programs on here that were not only, many of them were 40% above budget, but many, many years beyond the agreed upon schedule from the beginning. And then we have this thing called organization. Many think that the DoD is not organized, especially in the space arena, to develop these agile concepts. This is just one of them that I know that you guys are working in the building. So based on all of your experience in the building, what's the way ahead? Is the chief, I know the secretary is thinking about it, is the chief aware of this, and what do you think the success probability is for these kinds of activities in this environment?
Thanks, Mylan. So basically, in the last minute, how would I reform acquisition?
We're out of time. I'm sorry.
So first, let me caveat. It's only fair that I caveat that really my investigation has been centered on C2 systems. And the big acquisition, of course, was the AOC weapon system, and I dug into that. So it wouldn't be fair for me to comment on the other programs. I just don't have the details there. But I think there are a couple of things that I learned looking at the AOC program and how we procure particularly software-intensive programs, which you find a lot in the AOC business. And one is our tendency to aggregate requirements into the mega programs of record. There's probably good reasons to do that. Not being an acquirer, I grant that there are probably reasons to track a big bin of requirements to meet some command and control, for instance, purpose. What I find is that then it becomes an integration problem. It's not necessarily a tech problem, it's an integration and testing problem, which kind of expands the timeline, which makes the technology issue not as relevant by the time you get to it. And so disaggregation of those requirements, I think, is one of the things that we're pursuing. You know, there's no reason why the tanker planning tool isn't a small subset of requirements that's procured independently from the COP, from the battle damage assessment tools, from a space collision avoidance tool. Those seem to be that you could package those in small requirements, find the non-traditional vendors to support those. Now there's a lot of prerequisites to that. You got to have an architecture that's modern and can be easily integrated to. Those are some of the nested requirements that we're kind of working to make sure that that's true. So disaggregation of requirements, I think, is important. And then we just have to get to a different culture for software development. I had the opportunity to brief the Defense Innovation Board, and when I talk about software delivery or software requirements, it just doesn't compute. In terms of business best practices, that idea that you pitch requirements over, they develop software, give it back to you, and then it's delivered to you, and that works. They see it more as a continual evolution and perpetual process. Our acquisition process is a little more designed for big major programs that are hardware intensive, and then our application of those principles to software seems to slow us down a little bit. But those are the kind of things we're trying to at least identify and say, is there a different way that we could take some of these best practices, keep it inside the federal oversight requirements that are there, but go faster in terms of software intensive systems, particularly with C2. Disaggregate the requirements, find a way to do DevOps and delivery a little faster. That's what I'm focused on.
Okay, I think it's time to cut this off. Let's give Salty a round of applause. Great.